Good morning, everyone. It's the fifth Sunday after Pentecost. We are beginning services tomorrow in the church, and I asked Charlie to video the sermon from the pulpit. But Gwen said, it's really nice to have the intimacy of me preaching in the dining room of our home. And so I'm going to do that today again, instead of from the pulpit tomorrow. And you can tell me what you like. Send some comments if you wish about whether you prefer this way or from the pulpit. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. John the Baptist began his ministry by going down to the Jordan and preaching a baptism for repentance. He called people to turn away from the way they've been living, turn back to God, and to show that they have turned by going and being baptized. When Jesus saw that his cousin had begun his ministry, Jesus went down also to the Jordan and asked John to baptize him. John didn't want to. He said, no, you should be baptizing me. I should not be baptizing you. But Jesus said, no, let it be done for righteousness' sake. And so John baptized him, and after he spent the 40 days in the wilderness being tempted, Jesus began his ministry up in Galilee. By the time we get to chapter 11 of St. Matthew, we find that John has been arrested by Herod. John was a tough character. John was someone who spoke out boldly, who spoke what was on his mind. He was an Old Testament kind of prophet. He was fire and brimstone, if you will. And so when Herod married his brother's wife, he called him on it. He said, that's sinful. That shouldn't be done. Well, of course, Herod didn't want anybody out there in Jerusalem saying that he was a sinner. And so he had John the Baptist arrested and thereby shut him up. However, John kept track of what was going on with Jesus. And at one point, he was confused. And he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one who is to come? Or shall we wait for another? Because John expected Jesus to act like he acted, to preach the kind of same message that he preached. And John didn't do that. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus was gentler. And so Jesus answers John's disciples by saying, go back and tell John, the deaf can hear, the blind can see, the lame can walk, dead are raised to life, and good news is preached to those who are poor. And that gets Jesus started on John, and he turns to the people around him, and he says, when you went out to see John, what did you expect? A blade of grass waving in the wind? Did you expect him to be wearing fine clothes like they do in the palace? He says, none of that. John came preaching God's word. John was somebody who lived simply, and he just wanted people to turn back to God, and that was his message. And so he goes on with John, and he says, if you go back and read the Old Testament, in the last book of the Bible, in Malachi says that Elijah will be coming before the great and terrible day of the Lord, before the Messiah comes. And Jesus is very straightforwardly, John is Elijah, whose coming was predicted in the Old Testament. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he again continues, because he's on a roll. What shall we say of this generation? And this generation could be the generation he's living in. It could be our generation. It's always the same. He says the generation is like children playing in the marketplace. There are those on one side of the street who say, come over here and let's sing and dance a joyful song. Across the street is another group. They say, no, we don't want to sing and dance a joyful song. You come over here and we're going to sing a dirge, and we're going to sing it mournfully. They can never get together. It doesn't matter how much they try. Everyone is wanting something different. And he relates this then to John and himself. He says, when John came, he fasted, he drank no wine, and people said he had a demon in him. The Son of Man came, as he refers to himself, and he said the Son of Man ate and drank, and everyone says he's a glutton and a wine drinker. They can't see what God is trying to do. What, you see, does it take? If you have ears, listen, open up your eyes. But sometimes it takes an awful lot. Mike Jaffe was a man who worked for a Fortune 500 company. He was very successful, but in his 30s, he didn't feel fulfilled. He had a small family that he wanted to be with. He wanted his life to have more purpose than it was having. Every morning was the same. His wife would drive him to the train station for the 2-hour ride into Manhattan. His little daughter, 1 year old, would be asleep in the back. And he was concerned because he never saw his daughter awake much. And he worried that his wife was like a one-parent person, taking care of his daughter pretty much by herself. And even though he was successful, making a lot of money, he didn't feel that things were meaningful for him. Life was very hectic. He didn't have time to breathe, let alone to think. And that's the way it went. All his friends seemed to be doing the same thing, so he followed along. But then one day, an abrupt change came. He decided that he was going to stay home, have breakfast with his wife and his little girl, and take a later train. He didn't feel right about it, but nevertheless, that's what he did. He knew his colleagues were coming in early, leaving late, but he was tired of being controlled by his job. They had a great time that morning, eating together. He and his wife, the little one, talking, and it was great. And then she drove him to catch a later train to work. But because of his decision to go in late to work, Mike was not in the office of the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, when the first jet ran into the North Tower. Because he stayed home later that morning, his life was spared. He has since written a book called Wake Up, Your Life is Calling. He now feels it's his mission to continue to help people find meaning in their lives and not just simply look for what the world calls success. But not everyone does that. Here it took a startling event to change him. But there are others, nothing seems to work. Jesus himself says, the wise and the intelligent think that they are so smart that they don't need God. Think that they are so smart that God isn't even around anymore. They miss seeing God's good news. And, we're worried about the church today, how many people have left it. But even those in Jesus' day who saw him face to face didn't always respond in the proper way. All they could see was themselves. There are several verses where he talks about the various cities and towns that he was in and how they heard the good news but didn't respond to it. And he speaks about Capernaum, where he seemed to have his base. And he said, if the miracles that were done for you were done for Sodom, remember Sodom and Gomorrah, if they had been done for Sodom, that town would still be around today. And so he turns to the people. He realizes that things are not good. They miss it. Only the people who are, as he says, babies, who aren't so thinking that they're so smart, they're the ones who hear the good news. And so he says, come to me, all of you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. We can understand that in several ways. There's another point in the gospel where Jesus visits a Pharisee, and they're having a meal together, and the Pharisee is upset that Jesus did not wash his hands before the meal. Now, we're not talking about washing hands because they were dirty. Your child comes in from having played hard outside, and you say, all right, go to the bathroom, wash your hands really good before you eat. They're filthy. And we're not talking about washing your hands because you've come in from the outside and have maybe been in touch with the COVID virus, and you want to wash your hands for 20 seconds and do each finger and get between the fingers. That's not what he's talking about here. There was a ceremonial law that required the Pharisee to wash his hands, not just at the beginning of the meal, but also between courses. And it was done in a very special way. They went to these stone vessels that held water. The water is kept purer here than ordinary water. And about an eggshell and a half was first poured on the fingertips of the person. and the person would hold his hand with the fingertips pointing up, and the water would run down his fingers down to his wrist. And then the person would take the fist of his right hand and rub it into the palm of his left, cleansing the palm. And then he would do the reverse with the right hand. And then finally, at the end, water again would be poured on the hands, but this time the hands would point down, and it would be poured from the wrist down so that the water would run off the fingertips. The Pharisee was insulted, you see, that Jesus did not participate in this. And Jesus turns to them and said, you'd be better off if you cleansed your hearts as good as you cleanse your hands. But this was a burden that they had. This was a yoke that was put on them by the law, which they tried to obey. And it is just cumbersome. Even though we today, as Christians, don't follow that, we are still burdened. We have homes, we have possessions, we have cars, we have money in the bank. But we're concerned about it all. We try to protect it, and so we buy insurance for this, and we buy insurance for that, and so on and so forth. And so if something happens, we've got insurance so that we will not be totally wiped out. But even so, we're made aware that if we go online, every time we go online, we're perhaps at risk of somebody finding out something and just going and taking out all of the money from our bank accounts. We're burdened by this, you see. We have worries. We have fears. We have frustrations. We have longings. We have resentments. We're laden down with this. One of the few programs that I'll watch on TV has been Grey's Anatomy. It's one of those medical shows that's been on for many, many, many years. And it's interesting. But I said this before to Gwen. I said, there's not one person in this show who seems to be happy. Not one person seems to be joyful. They're all burdened down with something, as if they're carrying this yoke on top of them, like you would put on a cow so that you could direct him. Jesus realizes we're human and we are all burdened down. But he says, lean on me. Lean on me. I am not hard to you. I am gentle. You don't need to go through all kinds of religious contortions. He says, all you need to do is trust what God is doing in me and through me. That's it. There is meaning for your life in me, because now you are connected with what is immortal, what is eternal. I can give you rest for your entire being. Just put yourself in my care. It doesn't mean we don't take out insurance. It doesn't mean we don't look over things. It doesn't mean we're not going to have worries anymore. But we can turn some of our concerns and our worries over to the Lord, because his yoke is easy. His burden is light. We know that he loves us. We know that he has died for us, that he cares for us, and that he will be there every moment of our lives as we look to him for his care, for his love. Amen.